Hey guys, it's Mr. Schmidt here, and in this video we're going to start a new unit called Aggregate Supply and Demand, in which we're going to model the concepts of unemployment, inflation, and GDP using the ideas of supply and demand that we talked about a lot in microeconomics, but we're going to tweak the graph to make it work for the whole economy as opposed to one individual market like we did with regular supply and demand. And so like we did with Unit 2 when we introduced supply and demand, we're going to do it in pieces. And the first piece here is aggregate demand. So aggregate demand is all the goods and services or real GDP that buyers are willing and able to purchase at different price levels. And so this definition looks similar to what we did with regular demand. Except for now, we have all goods and services rather than just looking at one individual good. It's still willing and able, so you have to both want to buy it and you have to be able to buy it. And instead of prices, we're looking at price levels. And this could be CPI, or this could be the GDP deflator. We looked at both of those at the end of Unit 11. And so the price level could be either of those. When we draw the graph in a minute, we're just going to use the generic term price level, but just so you know, it could be either of those. So aggregate demand basically represents everything that people want and are able to buy, and again, it's GDP. Also be careful to note that it is real GDP. We're doing GDP adjusted for inflation because we want to have the most accurate understanding of what people are willing and able to buy across the entire economy. So now let's go ahead and turn to drawing the graph. And of course, with a new graph, let's talk about labels. So on the horizontal axis, remember in the old supply and demand graph, this was quantity, right? Well, first of all, don't write the Q because we're about to erase it. But we're not going to do quantity this time because we want to look at all goods and services, not just one individual good. That's what the Q would do there. So instead, we need something that represents all goods and services, and that's going to be real GDP. Now, I want you to go ahead and write it out for the first time here, but we can abbreviate real GDP with a capital Y. And you can do that moving forward, but at least for now, write out real GDP so you know what it stands for. On the y-axis, we used to do P for price, but again, we need to look at more than just the price of one individual good or service, and so we're going to use the price level to reflect all goods and services in the economy, because that's what aggregate supply and demand does. We're looking at the entire economy as opposed to just one good or service. That's what we did with regular supply and demand back in Unit 2. So now that we have our labels, how would aggregate demand look? And the good news is it looks just like the regular market demand curves that we have been drawing for most of the year. And so it's just going to look like this, downward sloping, and capital A, capital D for aggregate demand. So again, downward sloping demand curve. And so what we notice here is that if the price level increases, that means there's inflation, and we learned that back in Unit 11, and real GDP demanded, this used to be quantity demanded back in Unit 2, so quantity demanded decreases, but here in the aggregate demand model, it's real GDP demanded decreases, right? So if you look at your graph, if the price level falls, okay, real GDP demanded would increase. If the price level increases, real GDP demanded falls. So there's an inverse relationship between the price level and real GDP, and that's reflected in the graph. Because if prices are higher, I still don't want to buy as much as if prices were lower. It's the same relationship we learned back in Unit 2. We're just now taking it to the whole economy. Now, there are three different reasons why aggregate demand slopes downward. And as you can see here, they're very different reasons than why the market demand curve slopes downward. So you got to keep them separate and don't mix them up. The first one is called the wealth effect. And this is the idea that a higher price level reduces the purchasing power of money, Remember, we talked about the idea of purchasing power being how many goods or services your money can buy, and that reduces spending. If my money doesn't go as far, I can't buy as much, and therefore real GDP is going to decrease as the price level increases. So each of these effects are basically explaining how do we get from an increased price level to lower GDP. And again, what I want to hammer home here is that you need to connect GDP with spending. Put those two concepts together in your mind, because using the expenditure approach we learned back at the beginning of Unit 11, we can measure GDP through spending. The second one here is the interest rate effect, and this is our first encounter with interest rates. So interest rates are the cost or the price of borrowing money, and interest rates play such an, I'm going to start here, such an important part in the economy. We need to understand interest rates, and we're going to talk about them a lot. And interest rates work as a way to incentivize or de-incentivize spending. For example, if the price level is higher, lenders are going to realize, oh, there's inflation. Remember, we learned that lenders are hurt by inflation. And so lenders are going to raise interest rates to compensate for the fact that the money they're going to get back from borrowers isn't worth as much. And so because interest rates are higher, consumers, businesses aren't going to borrow as much money because it's more expensive to do so. And because they're not borrowing as much money, there's less spending. So think about this. So we had a higher price level, and so that increased interest rates, and that decreased consumer spending and investment spending. So do you see this chain of events? That is macro, and that honestly I think is the hardest thing for students to understand with the AP macro exam and just macroeconomics generally, is understanding cause and effect. One thing leads to the next, which leads to the next. This relationship between interest rates, borrowing, and spending is very important. Higher interest rates, less borrowing, less spending. Lower interest rates, higher borrowing, higher spending, right? So interest rates are a way to control how much spending and therefore how much GDP there is in an economy. If you want less spending, raise interest rates. If you want more spending, lower interest rates. Very important relationship to know. And then we've got the foreign trade effect. If there's a higher price level in the United States, for example, foreigners are not going to want to buy as much of our goods, right? So higher price level, and therefore lower net exports, and therefore lower real GDP. Okay? Because remember, net exports is a part of GDP. And if exports are falling because foreigners aren't buying as much of our stuff, that's going to lower GDP. I would really take some time, maybe re-watch what I just said about these effects, and pay attention to it a second time, because understanding the relationships here on this slide is going to be huge moving forward as we talk more and more about the economy and how policymakers can fix the economy. And then finally, of course, if it's a curve, the curves can shift. So what will shift the aggregate demand curve? Fortunately, you already know, because it's essentially the components of GDP. If there's a decrease in any component of GDP, C, I, G, or NX, that's going to move AD left. Remember, left is less. And if there's an increase in any component in GDP, consumer spending, investment spending, government spending, net exports, that's going to move AD to the right. So we already know the components. So for example, if consumer confidence skyrockets, more consumer spending, AD to the right. The one thing that will not move aggregate demand, just like with market demand, is a change in the price level rather than the price. If the price level changes, the quantity of real GDP demanded will change, and there's going to be movement along the demand curve. So you got to be, or aggregate demand curve. So you got to be very, very careful here that if there's a change in the price level, you move along the aggregate demand curve. Just like if there was a change in the price, you would move along the market demand curve. So that's all for this video on aggregate demand. Until next time, have a great day.